The morning of my wedding was supposed to be the pinnacle of a 4-year fairy tale, the golden threshold of a life meticulously designed for happiness. But as I sat in the plush velvet chair of the bridal suite, surrounded by the scent of expensive lilies and the frantic chirping of my bridesmaids, I felt nothing but a cold, metallic clarity. The sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting long, fractured shadows across my white lace dress. But to me, those shadows looked like bars. I wasn't a bride preparing for a union. I was a ghost inhabiting a corpse of a relationship that had died 6 months ago on a rainy Tuesday evening. Most people remember the moment they fell in love, the exact second the world shifted on its axis and everything made sense. I remember the exact second the world shattered. It wasn't a grand explosion. It was the soft, persistent chime of a forgotten tablet tucked into the side of the sofa. Mark had left for his weekly squash game, a routine I never questioned because trust was the oxygen of our relationship. The notification was a photo, a simple, high-definition image of Mark, my Mark, wearing the very same cashmere sweater I had bought him for our 3rd anniversary. He was at a sunny playground, lifting a giggling toddler into the air with a look of pure, paternal adoration I had never seen on his face before. A woman stood beside him, her hand resting with practiced familiarity on his lower back, her smile radiating the kind of peace that only comes from a secure home. The caption was a jagged blade to my heart. Daddy's home after a long week of work. We missed you so much. The realization didn't come in a wave. It came in a flood that drowned every memory I held dear. Every late night at the office, every urgent business trip to Chicago, and every weekend he spent helping his sick mother replayed in my mind like a horror movie with the sound turned off. I sat on our expensive Italian leather sofa for 3 hours, staring at that screen until the light faded from the room. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. Something inside me simply clicked into place, turning the warmth of my love into a freezing, calculated resolve. I realized then that Mark wasn't just a cheater, he was an architect of lives. He had built 2 separate worlds with the same precision he used to design skyscrapers, and I was merely a tenant in one of them. The betrayal was so deep, so structural, that a simple confrontation felt inadequate. If I had confronted him that night, he would have lied. He would have used his silver tongue to weave a story of a mistake, a one-night stand that went wrong, or a distant relative he was helping. He would have manipulated my grief until I was the one apologizing for looking at his tablet. No, Mark didn't deserve a private conversation. He deserved an audience for the masterpiece of deception he had created. I spent the next 6 months living a double life that rivaled his own. Every time he kissed me, I felt a physical sickness, but I leaned into it, returning the gesture with a performance that would have won an Oscar. I planned this wedding with a terrifying level of detail, choosing the most extravagant venue, the rarest flowers, and the most vintage champagne, all while knowing that every cent spent was a nail in the coffin of his financial and social standing. I became a silent observer in my own home, watching him navigate his lies with a terrifying ease. I watched him take work calls in the hallway, whispering sweet nothings to a woman named Sarah, the same woman from the photo. I tracked her down, not to attack her, but to understand the extent of his cruelty. She wasn't a mistress. She was a second wife in every sense but the legal one. She believed he was a high-stakes consultant whose job required months of travel. She was waiting for him to come home, unaware that he was currently picking out a 5-tier wedding cake with another woman. As I sat in that bridal chair today, listening to the hollow laughter of my friends, I realized that the porcelain mask of our perfect life hadn't just cracked, it had turned to dust. The man I was about to marry was a stranger I knew better than anyone else in the world, and today I was going to show the world exactly who he was. The music began to swell, the heavy doors of the chapel prepared to swing open, and I stood up,
smoothing the silk of my gown. The hunt was over. The execution was about to begin.
Once the initial shock subsided, I didn't reach for a suitcase. I reached for a notebook. If Mark was an architect of lies, I would become the master of his demolition. The next 6 months were a masterclass in psychological endurance, a period where I lived in a state of perpetual, frigid performance. By day, I was the blushing bride-to-be, obsessing over silk swatches and seating charts. By night, I was a digital ghost, tracing the digital and financial breadcrumbs of a man I realized I never truly knew. I began by digging into our joint accounts, only to discover a labyrinth of secondary ledgers and a shell company he had used to funnel thousands of dollars into a quiet life 2 towns over. It wasn't just a mistress, it was a mortgage, a minivan, and a life built on the stolen time he claimed was spent at late-night firm meetings. I tracked down the woman from the photo, Sarah, using the metadata from that singular, devastating social media post. She wasn't some calculating home wrecker. She was a soft-spoken woman who ran a small daycare, a woman who looked at Mark with the same naive devotion I once possessed. Under a pseudonym, I began frequenting the park where she took her son. I sat on the bench beside her, listening to her talk about her husband, who traveled for high-stakes consultancy, a man who was away for weeks but always came home with expensive gifts and a tired smile. It was sickening to hear my own life mirrored in her words, to realize we were both characters in a script he had written to satisfy his own ego. I didn't hate her. I felt a kinship with her, a shared sisterhood of the betrayed. As the wedding grew closer, my planning took on a darker, more expansive edge. I ensured that every contract, from the 5-figure floral arrangements to the world-class catering, was drafted in a way that placed the financial liability solely on Mark's personal accounts. I wanted him to be bankrupt in every sense of the word, emotionally, socially, and financially. I watched him at dinner, marveling at how easily the lies slid off his tongue, how he could talk about our future children while I knew he had a toddler waiting for him just 30 miles away. I began to plant the seeds of his downfall with a surgeon's precision. I befriended the tech coordinator at our venue, a young man who thought I was just a perfectionist bride wanting a very specific tribute video for the ceremony. I spent hours in the basement of our home, digitizing bank statements, lease agreements, and photos of his 2 separate lives, weaving them into a presentation that would look like a romantic slideshow until the very last second. Every time I felt like breaking, every time the weight of the charade felt too heavy to bear, I would look at the photo of that playground and remember that he wasn't just lying to me. He was stealing a life from 2 women and a child. I wasn't just a woman scorned. I was an instrument of cosmic balance. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, I was no longer a victim. I was a weapon, polished and aimed directly at the heart of his deception, waiting for the exact moment to pull the trigger in front of everyone he ever hoped to impress.
The heavy, ornate doors of the cathedral finally groaned open, and the swell of the organ filled the air like a tidal wave of sound. This was the moment of the grand performance, the culmination of 6 months of meticulous, silent calculation. As I stepped onto the white aisle runner, the scent of $5,000 worth of lilies hit me, a fragrance I had specifically chosen because it reminded me of a funeral. I clutched my father's arm, feeling his pride through the fabric of his suit, a pride that would soon turn into protective fury. Mark stood at the altar, looking every bit the protagonist of a romantic epic. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, his hair swept back with just enough calculated messiness to look boyish and vulnerable. When our eyes met, he gave me that small private wink he used to signify we were a team. It was a lie so practiced, it was almost beautiful. Every step I took felt like a heartbeat, heavy and resonant against the marble floor.
I didn't look at the smiling faces of our friends or the prestigious colleagues Mark was so desperate to impress. My eyes were fixed on the very last row, where a woman in a simple floral dress sat clutching a toddler's hand. Sarah looked small, out of place among the silk and diamonds, her face a mask of mounting confusion as she realized the business conference she was invited to attend as a VIP guest was actually the wedding of the man she called her husband. When I reached the altar, the air between us felt electric, charged with a secret only I truly understood. The priest began the liturgy, speaking of sacred covenants and the weaving of two souls into one, but his words were just background noise to the roaring in my ears. Mark took my hands, his palms warm and steady, a testament to his sociopathic calm. Then came the vows. He spoke first, his voice cracking with a manufactured emotion that brought tears to the eyes of half the congregation. He talked about how I was his anchor, how he had never known true honesty until he met me, and how he promised to spend every waking breath proving his devotion. I stood there, a statue in white lace, watching the red light of the professional videographer's camera. I had paid him a triple fee to ensure this entire ceremony was being live-streamed to Mark's firm's social media page under the guise of a modern wedding celebration. When it was my turn to speak, the room fell into a hush so profound you could hear the flickering of the altar candles. I didn't reach for my written vows. Instead, I looked directly into the camera lens and gave a sharp, deliberate nod to the tech booth at the back. The large projector screens, positioned high above the altar for what everyone assumed would be a montage of our engagement photos, suddenly flickered to life. The first image wasn't of us on a beach in Maui. It was a high-resolution scan of a lease agreement for an apartment in Sarah's name, co-signed by Mark 3 years ago. A collective gasp rippled through the pews like a physical blow. Mark's grip on my hands tightened, his eyes darting to the screen in sudden panicked recognition. Then came the photos. Mark at a birthday party for a child who looked exactly like him, Mark holding Sarah's hand at a grocery store, and finally the bank statements showing the systematic draining of our joint savings to fund his hidden household. The murmur in the room turned into a roar of shock. I pulled my hands from his as if his skin were made of acid. "You forgot to mention your other family in your vows, Mark," I said, my voice amplified by the lapel microphone and echoing through the rafters. I turned toward the back row and pointed. "Sarah, please, come meet the man who told you he was working today." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard.
The silence that followed my revelation was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of the cathedral. For a heartbeat, Mark's face was a grotesque mask of frozen calculation, his brain frantically trying to build a bridge of lies back to safety. But the bridge had been burned to ashes before he could even step onto it. Sarah stood up in the back row, her face a ghostly white that mirrored my own gown, the toddler in her arms beginning to whimper at the sudden jagged tension in the room. The transition from a sacred ceremony to a public execution was instantaneous. My father's hand, which had been resting proudly on his knee in the front row, flew to his mouth in a gesture of pure, visceral horror before he stood up, his protective instincts overriding the shock. The gasps from Mark's colleagues, the high-powered partners from his firm who valued integrity above all else, were the sound of his career disintegrating in real time. I watched the red light of the live stream camera, knowing that thousands of miles away, the digital record of his duplicity was already being shared, archived, and etched into the internet's permanent memory. Mark finally found his voice, a high, reedy sound that lacked all of his usual practiced authority. "Ilara, please, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered, reaching for my lace-covered arm. I recoiled with a physical revulsion so strong it felt like an electric shock. "It looks exactly like a man who bought a house for one woman while asking another to marry him," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic whimpers like a blade.
The chaos that erupted next was a blur of righteous anger. Sarah didn't stay in the back. She walked down the aisle, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome of doom. When she reached the altar, she didn't look at me with malice. She looked at Mark with the hollow eyes of someone who had just realized her entire life was a hallucination. The confrontation was short, sharp, and devastating. She didn't need to scream. Her presence alone was the final sentence in his trial. I didn't stay to watch the weeping or the inevitable excuses he would try to spin. I turned to the altar, picked up the heavy leather-bound guest book, and handed it to my father. "The reception is canceled," I announced to the room, "but the bar is open for anyone who wants to celebrate a narrow escape." I unclipped the heavy, suffocating veil from my hair and let it fall to the floor, a white shroud for a dead dream. As I walked back down the aisle, I felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. Every step away from him was a step toward a version of myself that was no longer a pawn in his game. The aftermath was a clinical dismantling of his ego. Because I had ensured the wedding contracts were tied to his personal accounts, the debt from this perfect day would haunt his credit for a decade. Within 48 hours, his firm issued a statement of parting ways due to a breach of moral conduct. Sarah and I met one last time, not as rivals, but as survivors, sharing a bottle of wine in a quiet park while her son played on the same swings where I had first seen them. We were the only two people who truly understood the monster he was, and in that shared understanding, the sting of the betrayal began to fade into a dull, manageable ache. I didn't just leave a marriage, I dismantled a predator. As I drove toward the coast that evening, the wedding dress packed away in a donation box and the horizon turning a brilliant, unapologetic orange, I realized that the happily ever after I had been promised was a lie, but the freedom I had earned was the truest thing I had ever known. I rolled down the windows, let the salt air fill my lungs, and for the first time in 6 months, I didn't just breathe, I lived.